Any airline passenger knows that being stuck in a plane on the tarmac for hours is no way to travel. Now, after a number of high-profile incidents, Congress could be ready to step in and give travelers a little help.
Unless the Congress acts on some version of passenger rights legislation this year, the cries of frustration from the tens of thousands of stranded passengers will not be heard.
Kate Hanai was on the 2006 American Airlines flight that was delayed for 9 hours. She's leading the charge for a passenger's Bill of Rights. If it becomes law, airlines would be forced to allow travelers the option to deplane after a 3-hour delay. Extreme cases have made national headlines. This summer, a Continental flight operated by ExpressJet sat on the tarmac in Rochester, Minnesota throughout the night. 2 weeks later, a Sun Country flight from JFK to Minneapolis kept passengers stranded for 6 hours. More than 1,000 flights were delayed on the tarmac for at least 3 hours from October 2008 to July 2009. A 2007 incident set off a call for reform that is yet to be realized. A snowstorm trapped hundreds of JetBlue travelers on airplanes for up to 11 hours at New York's JFK. Passengers were faced with no air conditioning, dirty bathrooms, and only snacks.
It was horrible to sit on a plane that long, to be pulled into a gate for 9 hours. It was horrible.
It was horrible, and our travel editor Peter Greenberg has more info on the rights we have as passengers, and Washington might be up to help. Good morning.
Maybe, maybe not.
All right, let's talk about, because there have been ideas, this has been kind of kicked around for a while now. What are some of the things that haven't worked?
Well, back in 2001, Senators McCain and Hollings introduced something, a passenger service bill, never got out of Congress. In 2007, people here in New York may remember the New York State Legislature passed unanimously a passenger Bill of Rights that called for severe financial penalties on the airlines. The airlines then went to federal court, got it thrown out, saying that the states have no right to regulate them.
Right.
That's the problem. And then, of course, then there was the idea of self-regulation. The airline said, please let us self-regulate. I don't have to tell you, Harry, what that means. The fox is running the chicken coop.
Exactly right.
And there was a task force called the Tarmac Task Force that came out last year to say, okay, here are some voluntary, there's another word I love, voluntary best practices, which, of course, not really happening.
There you go. Because we've seen it, the opposite of that all this past summer. There's something out there called the Boxer Snow Amendment. What is that?
That's a bill that's actually been introduced 3 other times and never got out of committee. It's now back on track to be voted on. Interestingly enough, it actually calls for the following: to provide food, potable water, cabin temperature, ventilation, and adequate restrooms.
Right.
But here's the key. After 3 hours, they have the option to let passengers get off the plane.
Right.
And, of course, there's some other rights involved there, too. But here's the question.
Okay.
Does it have teeth?
Okay. And the answer is?
Not a lot. Because here's the key word. After 3 hours, passengers can deplane the plane if the pilot reasonably believes that they are not going to be able to take off within 30 minutes. Now, you and I both know that every delay is a creeping delay, and nobody ever says the plane will be delayed 7 hours. It's always 30 minutes. 30 minutes, 30 minutes.
Because they check in and they check in and
so basically, you're waiting for Godot, and Godot doesn't show up.
There you go. Who likes this? Who's for this? Who's against it?
Airlines, of course, have always been opposed to it. A very interesting change, though. Robert Crandall, the former chairman of American Airlines, is now in favor of it. Wow. So you might actually have a situation where at least symbolically we'll get some legislation.
Right. What are airlines doing about this? What are they doing or not doing about this? Because we sit here and complain about it. We assume at some point they're listening to the complaint.
Some of them are, some of them are not. Southwest does a pretty good job. JetBlue does a pretty good job, especially after their incident in February of 2007 here at Kennedy. They're really trying hard to pull the plug on these flights and say, okay, we're not going, let's get them off.
Right. If you're a passenger on this flight, if, for instance, you were on that plane that sat on that tarmac in Rochester so famously this past summer.
Correct.
What can you do?
You got to go back to the future and realize there was a terrible incident more than 10 years ago in Detroit when over 8,000 passengers were stranded more than 8 hours. Wow. Now, a very interesting thing happened on those flights that day. There were a lot of lawyers on those planes. And some people might argue they should still be on those planes. But the bottom line is they filed a class action lawsuit which claimed, among other things, false imprisonment. And that's a very interesting legal case because about a week before the case was going to trial, the airlines wrote a check, a big check, because they realized they didn't want to set precedent. However, they did set symbolic precedent. The words false imprisonment should be on the minds of everybody who's trapped on those planes.
Can I ask you a question real quick? Because I thought to myself, if I were on that thing, I would have called 911. I would have called local law enforcement to say, this is nuts. There's an open airport and I'm trapped on this plane. Can you do anything about it?
Well, you and I have talked about this before. If I was on that plane, I would have actually declared I was sick. And by the way, when they took me off the plane, you know what I said? I would say I was sick of being on the plane.
There you go, Peter. As always, thank you so much. Good stuff.